Do your design files ever look like this? Want them to look more like this? Well, you're in luck. I'm going to take you through some quick tips so you can clean up your files and help you focus on designing great experiences. Let's get right into it. So there are two main components that I use when it comes to organizing my Figma files. The first one is all about the paging system and structure that I use. And the second is about how the content itself is displayed on the canvas. So to start with, I'm going to take you through each page individually and talk about what's contained within there, the different use cases they support, and how you can use a similar thing in your projects. So the first page we have on our list is the file cover. Now, this is effectively a thumbnail that gives a nice preview to what's actually contained within this file and some brief details that people can see when they're browsing through Figma. So if you're not familiar with this is used to give more context when it comes to this kind of view on the home screen, whether you're in your organization or company view or even in your drafts. You can see what's in the file and get some important information up front before opening it. So because this tends to be used in a smaller space, it makes sense to give more focus to the most important information. So in this instance, I focus on the project name in terms of the text treatment and styling, make that most prominent, and the status here. So what I tend to do is use this pill component that has, in this instance, has 3 different states where you can give more context to where that project or feature is currently at to those people who are browsing through Figma. So the way that I power this is if anything isn't ready for dev that is actually ready to be picked up, I would tend to set this to ready or complete, so to give the engineering team a heads up that things are actually ready to pick up. Of course, we'd have discussions outside of Figma, but it does give the extra context if you are browsing through looking for a particular file or feature. Additional information that you can add, so some branding, some extra description to give more context to this file. This is something that won't be as visible when it comes to the file browser. However, if people open up this particular feature file and need more context, it's nice to have that description there if needed. And if you're not familiar with how to set this up, by default, Figma will just take a snapshot of your file and use that as the thumbnail preview. But you can create a frame that's dedicated to this cover by going into the Figma community section, and you can take that file cover there, preset. And then once you've created that cover, there'll be an option there on right click to set as default thumbnail. Always useful to have that to clean up your Figma workspace. So next up we have the project or feature overview, which is pretty much a table of contents for what is actually within this file. So at a basic high level, you could just put links to each of those pages so there's a user-friendly way for people to navigate, or you could deep link into specific parts of each page if you want to give more specific information at this point. But effectively, it's just a nice way to give that extra level of organization for somebody browsing this file. So think of it as a launch pad for the key areas of your design work. Next up, we have the design checklist, which is a great way to keep you accountable with the designs that you're producing. So the goal of this is to make sure that you're on track in terms of the standard that you set for the design work that you produce. So this could be something that's purely individual, it could be part of a team ethos, it could be something that you agree on as a wider product team as well. But effectively the goal is just to give you that quick high-level overview and functionality to check these off when you meet certain criteria. So things like personas and user flows, having those in place is obviously key. And then getting more specific in terms of like mobile screens, different states when it comes to forms and CTAs and buttons and that kind of thing. Like making sure you've got those all as part of your designs. It's just like a sanity check that you can have here to make sure that you're happy with the work that you've produced. In addition to that, it's obviously key to keep an eye on accessibility. So making sure that the standard you adhere to is met within this specific feature. And things like behavioral annotations, which is something I'll talk about when we get further down the page list. So these annotations are something that I personally like to use to call out any nuance or things that aren't easily communicated through prototypes as a reference for engineers to show them how a particular part of a design behaves, kind of like redlining in a similar way. but at a more interaction level. So we'll get to that when we move into the different design milestones. So next up we have the Ready for Dev page, which is a great example of how people outside of the design team would use Figma. So they're coming in here to find the latest designs, and we want to make that as easy as possible. So I do this in a few different ways. So the first one is keeping it relatively near the top in terms of the list of pages. So once you get through all the intros and overviews, then the first thing after that is the latest set of designs that have been signed off, that have been agreed, and they're ready to go into build. And the second way we can do this is by using Figma's feature here that they've added recently, whereby you can actually mark these as ready for dev. So whether you're in the standard view or in dev mode, you have this toggle here that you can turn on, which reflects in context of the canvas and also on the page name there, which is super useful. So when your engineers come in, they can toggle to dev mode and they can see there a filtered list of pages, which will only show the pages that contain items that have been marked as ready for dev. So super useful, and just another way that really kind of adds that support for that particular use case, which is really, really useful. And then within here, I will structure this in a consistent way that you'll see going forward. And the style that I use tends to be a title bar that sits along the top of a frame that contains the flow of designs. So it just keeps things really organized, because I know it can be quite easy to get in the position where your files start to become messy because you've got designs in different places, you're experimenting with different patterns and styles and behaviors, that it's all too easy for that canvas to get fairly messy, which if you know what you're looking for, then perfect. But when you're opening this up to your team and actually handing over design work and UX flows, it's important to keep things as organized as possible. So this is the approach that I use, and it does kind of advance as you go through some of these milestone pages, but to keep things really focused on the content and on what's being handed over, I would keep this flow fairly minimal in terms of the actual content around these designs. What I like to do as well is also call out any specific behavioral nuance. So something that's sometimes quite difficult to illustrate in terms of behavior when it comes to a Figma prototype are things like kind of how things scale and behave when, let's say, character limits exceed a certain amount, or a specific breakpoint that is quite hard to replicate when it comes to that responsive behavior. I just like to use this style of annotation just to kind of call out a particular part of the design and then just add some notes there below. So not only the design team, but also the engineering and product can understand what's actually meant to happen here, which can kind of act as like an acceptance criteria at a very low level, just to make sure that the design is functioning as intended and as tested. So something there that I like to do when it comes to the developer handoff. Because there's potentially multiple stages of design and different patterns and different thinking that have gone into this file at various different stages of the project, we want to make sure that what's actually handed over to the team to build is definitely the right piece of work, because we'll get into different milestones shortly, but there are different versions of similar designs. So by making sure that this is super clear that it's ready for dev, it really helps to alleviate the wrong thing being built. So the next page we have is dedicated to prototypes. Now we might have a particular flow that we want to take into usability testing. So the way that I've found most effective is just to completely separate this out into its own page. So take a duplicate of the part of the flow that we're testing and move it into its dedicated page. This way, we don't run the risk of a prototype that is jumping into designs that aren't fully validated or ideas that we don't actually want to test. We can keep this very separate and very focused on a particular flow. And much like what we've seen in Ready for Dev, we use a very similar approach when it comes to giving this flow the title, so we know which part of the journey it relates to and which part in the build process that it relates to. So we can be super clear on what we're actually testing. And then for the screens below, we can start to build our prototype. And another reason for separating this out is that I've often found some strange behavior when it comes to prototyping screens that sit within parent frames, and it just makes it a lot easier if you can break this out of any additional frames and start to just create that prototype in isolation. And then once the prototype is set up, in terms of naming that flow, I tend to follow a very similar naming convention to what's been used in the file. So if we look at the milestone 1, that's the MVP flow, just using a very similar name when it comes to the prototype itself will make it a lot easier to manage and to refer back to the designs once the testing has taken place and you're analysing results and bringing that back into the flow that we have here. So now we're actually getting into the design work itself. So these two pages here, you'll see M1 and M2. So this is milestone 1 and milestone 2. So two examples here of how you would progress particular designs and present that in Figma. So this approach has worked really well for me, especially when working with in-house product teams, because you can align very closely to the product roadmap and what the engineers are actually building, and therefore you can tie back the business and user value to specific parts of the design and align to those goals. So in this scenario, let's say this feature is actually something that we're going to deliver an MVP for to validate and understand where we should move forward. Now, in this case, the first milestone, I'm going to label that as MVP, and then we're going to provide some additional context. So much like we've been doing up to now, we have this same structure when it comes to the flow, but I like to add specific context around that particular milestone, which usually comes in the form of a list of requirements. And as I say, this marries up quite nicely to what you're trying to achieve with the particular launch of this MVP, let's say. So you can have that in the design file so that you know everything you design thereafter needs to match up to these requirements. And then something else that I tend to do as well is link off these requirements to specific parts of the flow. So when you're in present mode and you're sharing this with stakeholders, you can kind of list off, here's the requirements that we're looking to meet, and then click through and take you to that specific flow and part of the design. And you can really hone in on how design is actually providing value to not only the users, but the business as well, which is a really good thing to get in place and something really important that you should be championing as part of your teams. So that's something that I've found works really well. And then thereafter, it's effectively that same setup for the flows. And obviously you can create as many of these as needed. But one thing I do find is important to preserve a snapshot in time. So what I mean by that is I found it really easy to kind of just start to override design decisions in Figma and make updates. And yes, there is that version history feature, but it is always a lot easier just to kind of separate those stages of design out so you can start to see how things have progressed over time. And if you want to link back to a point in time and share that with the team, almost to show where we started and the progression of that particular feature, it's always nice to have those milestones separated out so you can go back and do that fairly easily. So that's how I like to separate out the actual design work, as it were. So we have these specific milestones, and then I will just add additional pages as the milestones increase for that particular feature and allow as many as needed. And to round everything off, I always like to include research findings, ideation, exploration, personas, everything that helped us arrive at the design decisions that we did right here within the same file. So to start with, we have inspiration and exploration. So here I would add in any snippets of inspiration from other websites and apps and just kind of things that went into the ideation in terms of the styling and color palette and just general structure of the design. So anything here will just be grouped and arranged in a way that makes sense. Next up, I like to include more information around the actual user journey, the personas, and anything that helped us understand the flow of the designs. So giving a snapshot here for anyone who wants to come in and view this information is always super useful. And not only that, it really helps to keep track of these things in a single place when it comes to building your portfolio or case studies, and you can have this material available to add in there when needed. Again, I will use the personas. In this case, I like to set a different hierarchy in terms of when it comes to the personas themselves. So let's say you've got a primary use case that you're going after, kind of marking that clearly as the primary user that you're targeting and that you're supporting. And then thereafter, if there are secondary personas that also fall into this product, then we can add those in as well. and just making that clear as you go through the different user types. So always useful to have those included. And then things like market research. So if you're looking at competitor analysis, I would use a similar format in terms of breaking down the flows, so you can then start to add some notes and some context around what you found interesting, what was useful, and the kind of things that you learned that you can pass through and carry on into the UX of the product that you're designing. Just really useful to keep track of these things in the same file. And then finally, a word on components. So I've not talked about design systems in this video, purely because I would normally separate out the design system and not have it embedded in the specific feature files. But there are occasions where you might have local components. So you'll see here, you'll probably recognize these two components that we've used in the cover for the status pill and for the checklist and that kind of thing. These are all local components that are just created solely for use within this file. And a tip to manage this is if you prefix the name of that page with an underscore, and if you do the same with these components themselves, that means that there's no risk of those being used outside of this file. Let's say if this ever gets used as a library, or if you're kind of arranging your design system in individual files and this kind of gets caught up in there, then you don't run the risk of these becoming global components and having to unpick any of that work. So a little tip there if you want to make sure that these stay locally scoped to this file. And there you have it, my quick tips for organizing your Figma files that you and your team can use today. If you found this useful, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.